Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Megan Hall. I teach English in our liberal arts division, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there today. This training takes up two of my classes, and we've had some snow days, so I couldn't afford to lose the time. But I'm really excited to be talking to you. And I have some materials that you guys can look at, so I think it'll be a good conversation for all of you anyway, I'm hoping. So we're going to talk about English 123 and then English 124. We really do think of them as a sequence of courses. So for some of you, you might just be teaching one. For some of you, you might be teaching both. But it's kind of interesting to see how they dovetail and how we're laddering those skills in those courses. So I want to talk a little bit about the student learning outcomes, what we typically do in a class, and what we typically assign, and then we'll get into the assessment methods and what we're hoping to do for next year when we assess the course again. So for English 123, you guys have copies of our learning outcomes that you can see on the rubric that we used for our last assessment. And I've given you guys the directions that we had for our last assessment as well. Hopefully you have those in front of you. But if you don't, I'm going to read it anyway. So our first learning outcome has to do with process. And this is really, in my opinion, one of the most important things about our English classes, that we really do stress the writing process. A lot of people come into class saying that they hate English, that they're no good at English, and I think that's partially because in their previous classes, maybe it was just stressed to like turn in one paper and to get it right the first time, right? So our outcome is demonstrate through multiple drafts a writing process that includes invention, revision, editing, and proofreading. And so in the portfolios that the students put together, they really should have some things to show that process. In the one portfolio from my class last term that I've given you guys, you can see that somebody included their journal where I had them choose a research topic and tell me why they wanted to write about their topic. I believe that he also, in that portfolio, also has his annotated bibliography to kind of show the research process that they went through before starting their paper. And then for that paper, we have the first draft and then the final draft to show the kind of revision and editing and proofreading process that the student went through. Similarly, one of the other portfolios, as there's a requirement for the portfolio, we have a first draft and a final draft there as well. And that person included some assignments that were just basically like mini reflections, and I thought that was kind of an interesting choice because she wanted to really show how she came up with her ideas and what she felt like she did well with and what she felt like she still needed to work on. So our next outcome is quality, producing cohesive essays with well-developed paragraphs and varied sentence structure. One of the things that I noticed the last time we assessed this course with a lot of instructors, not everybody, but many people, that the portfolios had a lot of stuff in them that weren't necessarily essays. And it's okay if students want to choose a couple of artifacts. Like I mentioned, one of my students did a couple of her reflections. Another one included some of their smaller journals. I had another one who asked if they could put something in from their other classes, and they talked about what they learned in my class that applied to those classes. And that was fine. But for the most part, it really should be, outside of maybe one or two artifacts, what we're really looking for are quality essays. So when we get into the actual portfolio requirements, we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth. But things that would not necessarily go in there would be handwritten in-class writing assignments, tests I had a number of portfolios that had like multiple choice tests and things like that in there. And those are not really what the portfolio is about. The portfolio is really meant to show process and also that the student is able to develop a paper of quality. So there are a couple different portfolio models. There's a growth model and then there's an excellence model. And I talk to students about both of those and let them kind of choose if they want to show and kind of focus on their growth throughout the course, where they started versus where they ended, or if they want to just showcase kind of their best work that they've done. And choosing those artifacts for the portfolio can do that. But in any case, at the end of the day, we're still looking to make sure that even if they've grown to the level that they need to be. Addressing specific audiences is next, so having a rhetorical awareness. Addressing specific audiences and adapting writing to specific purposes, considering content, tone, and diction. I would also say we call it rhetorical awareness, but I would also say that this is media and information literacy. So information literacy, we've got a little bit later, I guess, locating and ethically selecting and incorporating research material. But media literacy, we've found, has been increasingly important, that our students very often don't quite understand when something is being persuasive, that they take a lot of things at face value as just informing them. So talking about where things are being persuasive, where an author or a media source is being manipulative, looking at things like audience purpose and tone and getting them to kind of recognize that, because before you have those conversations, a lot of times they'll be like, it's just written for anyone. And so we talk about things like target demographics, how many authors and people with media content and content creators, how they're looking for specific audiences. And then how tone affects the reader and what the author's attitude is, what emotions they're using. We hit on things like ethos, pathos, and logos. We talk about professional audience versus academic audience versus like the expert or the amateur, or how things are for a broader range sometimes, and how they're meant to kind of hit a wider target. So understanding those things and understanding media manipulation is, I think, really vitally important right now. And then we kind of get students to think about how they would use those same concepts in their own writing. So if you look at the portfolios that are provided, I picked an article for their first paper where they did a rhetorical analysis. They talked about all those things. And I think that you don't have to have that exact assignment, but at least something in class. I also have done things where, like, I show a documentary and then we talk about the rhetoric used, and we kind of pause as we watch, and then we debunk it, which is a lot of fun too. So you can do those kind of things as well when doing rhetorical analysis. Knowledge of conventions is next, applying the conventions of standard written English, including grammar, usage, mechanics, citation, and documentation. So we use MLA for this course, and it's helpful, I think, for students sometimes to have sample papers for MLA so that they can see how the whole thing will be formatted. When I do MLA citation, I do talk about citation generators. A lot of students know about them and want to use them anyway. But I also talk about the limitations of those. And it's kind of like a calculator, right? Like, if I don't know the difference between the division sign and the minus sign, I'm not going to get it right. We also, some other things that we do with citation, just know that we're in MLA 9. So that's what we are using currently. And yeah, I don't really know if I have more to say about that. So Again, because this is what we're looking for in the portfolio, I will say this. The documents that you are getting for the portfolio should be building their knowledge of conventions. So if you notice, some of my students in the first essay, they don't have necessarily like a works cited page, but they are doing some in-text citation. By the third essay, they should have in-text citation correctly formatted, and a works cited page, again, correctly formatted. So those are, again, if you're only giving us portfolios that have handwritten things that they've done in class, you're not going to get that proper knowledge of conventions. So that's just something to consider. Argument, developing an argument with claim and reasons. So the thing I want to say here is that previously in this course, a few years ago, the research and the argument were combined, and you can still do that. I do that in my classes, and some of the other instructors do as well. Other instructors do not, and they have students write a research paper, and then they have them write an argument paper, and separate out those two outcomes. So that's kind of up to you. You can do it either way. As long as they're hitting both of those outcomes, then it's fine. What I think is helpful to have both, I find a lot of students struggle trying to make an argument if they don't have research, and then they end up having a really uninformed argument. And they struggle with that invention part of the writing process, right? It's a little bit more difficult for them. And then what you end up having is kind of arguments based in opinion, which is not really an argument. It's really an opinion, which we also talk about. So a claim and reasons, and going over that, talking about things like the 3 pillars of argument with ethos, pathos, and logos, talking about things like logical fallacies is another thing we cover, again, kind of tying into that media literacy aspect. Tying in the argument to the rhetorical awareness can be really helpful as well, and getting them to move beyond just opinion. One of the things that I find really helpful is having students, they do need to develop a thesis statement, not a thesis question. When they're writing, they need to have that statement in the beginning of their paper. But I think that it can be really helpful for them to go into the research process with a question, because a lot of times their opinions or their thoughts are formed by something they kind of half listened to or kind of saw on social media, or something maybe their parents believe, or they have kind of a formed idea, and then when they go to do their research, they realize that they're incorrect. So I like to have them keep an optimistic. I like to have them keep an open mind when they go into their research process, to look at things from multiple perspectives and different sides, so that they don't go in and just get sources that are basically confirming biases. And again, media literacy. I can't stress that enough, I feel like, right now in our world. And process, what some people do, I mentioned I have an annotated bibliography. I have them do a research proposal. I have them do some initial exercises looking at things like opposing viewpoints database, or looking at the current news stories, things like that, to kind of generate some ideas about what they might want to write about. One of our other instructors has students identify a local problem. So they think about a problem in their home, school, community, town, city, a local problem that they can identify, and then they go about doing some research about what that problem is, what are some of the causes, what are the effects, and how maybe could it be solved. But again, really going into the argument before they start writing, really going in kind of with an open mind. And if you wanted to do something like that, I've had a class before where I did that as a project, and The class as a whole picked the topic. They all wrote their own essays about it. And then we also did service learning. So once they had different ways and identifications of what could be done to solve the problem, they made a decision about one thing that they could do as a class project. And they ended up doing some really interesting advocacy and awareness stuff, some videos and some letter writing and some posters and things like that. So be creative with it if you want. In their portfolio, you could have them put those things in as some of their writing artifacts. So information literacy, I've been talking about media literacy, but our official learning outcome is information literacy. So locating and ethically selecting, evaluating, and incorporating research material from library databases and other appropriate sources. So they should have at least one essay where they have used library databases and where they have located things in the library database, so that that's a skill that they've learned how to do that, ethically selecting and not using chatbots and not just copying and pasting things, and evaluating. So sometimes that can be a separate assignment, again, having something like an annotated bibliography, or I have another assignment I do sometimes where they find a news article and they talk about what biases they see in that article, and they kind of analyze the rhetoric a little bit. So evaluating in that way. And incorporation. So how to quote, how to paraphrase, how to summarize, how to make sure that they're citing things correctly, all of that. So those are our official student learning outcomes for English 123. Then we have two categories that are really just for us that we look at, and that is selection and reflection, and then whether or not the portfolio is complete. So the portfolio directions, which you should have say very specifically that there have to be so many essays, that at least one is other than a personal narrative. One contains, I'm reading it now, sorry, a 2 to 3 page reflection in which the student carefully evaluates the writing process. So again, having them do some metacognition about the process that they went through, what they did well, what they didn't, what they still need to work on for the next course. 2 essays other than a personal narrative. So if you have them do a personal narrative, that's fine, but not all the essays should be personal narrative. I've gotten some portfolios like that as well. At least one has research with citations, and at least one must be an argument. Those can be the same essay if you want. The student can again include other essays, journals, writing assignments, and some pre-writing too. I find a lot of students, when they want to show their writing process, they want to include things like their outline or their research proposal, or brainstorming activity and that kind of thing. But another one of our requirements for the portfolio is that it must be typed and submitted as one document. So if you don't have a learning management system, that's okay. If you have students just submit everything as hard copies, but it is, for us, one electronic document. Sometimes students will put other things in there. So I've had people take like a picture of their brainstorming and a photo of their outline that they hand wrote, but they kind of put that in again alongside most of the things typed out and with proper formatting. And again, I think you can see that from the samples that I gave you. Sometimes too, students want to include their final presentation, which I'll talk about in a moment, and that is perfectly fine, except that it can be difficult to get that all in one document. You can turn a PowerPoint, for example, into a PDF, but then you have to kind of have the skills to combine that with the Word document or whatever you're kind of doing. So if they want to do that, that's fine. Or if they want to submit it in addition and kind of just say, this is also part of my portfolio, that would be fine as well. So stress to them that portfolio artifacts should be chosen, again, looking at growth or excellence or both. And sometimes you'll have students who have really high quality, but their portfolios are not complete. And that's why we have really that completion requirement. The selection and reflection isn't right now a student learning outcome, but we're thinking about making it a student learning outcome. So that's one of the reasons that we wanted to assess for it. So 20 minutes in, and I have not kind of explained assessment, and I feel like I should, so apologies. I used to work in K through 12, and I taught preschool for a while as well, and I got bitten by a couple preschool kids, and I was like, I can't do this. So that's why I teach at a college now. But at any rate, we talk in K through 12 a lot of times. We speak about assessment a little bit differently than we do at least at SUNY Schenectady. So when you're grading a student or giving them a test, we refer to that as evaluation. You're evaluating their work and a lot of times the quality of their work, right? Assessment is quite a bit different because we're not really evaluating the student's performance. We're evaluating really our job as teachers to see if we have taught the student learning outcomes and to see if the majority of students are meeting those outcomes or exceeding them. If you have if you do the portfolio rubric for your students and you find that a lot of them are not, then it's not necessarily also I don't know how to put this. It's not necessarily, it could be that you need to rethink your teaching methods. I know I have had to do that a couple of times with assessments that like, oh, a lot of my students are not hitting the MLA formatting and the knowledge of conventions. I really need to stress that more. Or they really are doing great research, but when it comes to argument, it's not quite there. So yeah, it's a time for kind of you to reflect, but there's nothing that, it's not used in a punitive way. I guess that's the best way that I can put it. It's a time for us to reflect as instructors to see if we can do anything to help our students meet the learning outcomes, and also to see if the learning outcomes need to be changed. If we feel like, hey, selection and reflection shouldn't be a learning outcome, maybe that's not really important or a skill or knowledge that I want them to have in terms of how they put together their portfolios, then maybe we don't include that. Maybe it's really confusing what quality means, and maybe we need to delineate that a little bit more and rewrite that student learning outcomes so that students have a better understanding of what's required of them. I will say too that especially when we're assessing this course, I think that it's important pedagogically to tell the students what the learning outcomes are at the beginning of class and to reinforce those as you go. So to say, hey, today we're working on brainstorming ideas for your research papers, and we're going to do some initial research, and that's going to hit our outcomes on process and also information literacy. Or today we're going to look at advertisements and things from Instagram, and we're going to talk about how those people are selling you things, and that's going to hit our learning outcome of rhetorical awareness. So I think it's helpful for students to kind of know what we're looking for as we go and what's expected of them. But yeah, the assessment really, the tool for the assessment is primarily the portfolio, and then the rubric is measuring that tool. We also have, for our assessment, we also have a couple things that SUNY requires for this course to be considered a basic communications course. Any basic communication course per SUNY has to have an oral presentation component. And also, just smacked my arm on my desk. And also evaluating the presentation of others. So what we basically decided to do in the past, and I don't know whether or not we will do it a second time, but what we did before was we chose some videos from YouTube of students giving presentations, and then we had students write a short journal entry talking about that presentation and evaluating it based on the criteria that we then also used to evaluate their presentations. So it had them again thinking about their learning outcomes and evaluating a presentation, but I think in kind of a safe space so that they didn't feel like their peers were evaluating them, which is how people have interpreted it before, and it just makes students a lot more nervous when they go to present. A lot of them are quite nervous already, as I'm sure you guys know. So for the oral presentation, that can be up to you for how you want to interpret that. Sometimes I have my students present their research paper. I've had them before in the past because I had just different groups doing different things based on what they needed. I have had some of them present their portfolio and talk about what they chose for each project and each topic. I've done it also where they pick a new topic and form an argument about that and do research and then present it. And sometimes that might be an informative report kind of thing, and sometimes it might be an argument based on whatever the prompt is that I've given them. So it kind of depends how much time you have to do that, but it is again, it's a requirement of the course, and for the course to count as a SUNY Gen Ed, it has to be in there. So that will be part of what you give us as well, the assessments for those. And again, if you feel like students didn't do well with that, put it in the assessment. Sometimes we wonder if we need to stress the oral presentation more, or if they just need a week or two to work on it, or maybe they need a whole unit where I've done that before with a class that was very nervous about the presentation, like talking with them a while about different showing different presentations and breaking them down and talking about what people did well and what people didn't do well. And again, sometimes doing that rhetorical analysis. Okay, so that kind of sums it up for English 123. You've got some sample portfolios, and you have the rubric, and you have a discussion where you can look over the assignments and the sample portfolios and kind of pair them up and match them up against the rubric. And if we have time, once you're done with that, I'll come back and talk about English 124. And if we don't, there's a YouTube link for it. I talked a little bit longer on here than I meant to. Also, you guys should have my contact information, so if you have questions at any point, you can ask. I'm giving you the directions for the assessment that we did the last time. I don't know if those will change or not. The chances are they probably will, but we're going to decide that in May, so you will have all of that before you start teaching for sure in the fall. So that's it. Thanks.